And now here is Daniel again.
Oh, goodness. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thanks for having me back. It's wonderful to be here again. I see a number of familiar faces. I will just go over a few housekeeping things, but before I start, just want to remind you, I'm here doing this on behalf of Digging Deeper, a little LLC I've started to try to bring trainings and understanding of complex social topics like homelessness, poverty, mental illness to the community. If you're ever interested in having that brought somewhere else, there you volunteer or work or attend, please reach out. Today's presentation, I do want to kind of remind you, interactive style is kind of my preference. So we'll have time for discussion questions. And for those, I'll have you turn to someone sitting near you, discuss it a little bit, and then we'll come back together and hear some responses. We'll have some popcorn questions where I'm just looking for someone to shout out and answer. Those will usually be very quick, short answers like a number. And at the end, we'll have a Q&A. If it is a discussion question or you have a question that's more than just a word or two, really, if it's more than just kind of shouting out a number, please do wait for the microphone. That helps me hear you better, and it helps our Zoom participants be able to stay involved. And with those microphones, go ahead and put that thing right up to your mouth. That really helps. So with that said, we're going to start with the discussion question. For those of you who maybe were not here last week, I'm going to start you off with a similar question to what we started last week with, which is, what does it mean to be poor? And for those of you who were here last week, I'm curious, what was the most surprising or impactful thing you learned last week? So chat with someone next to you. We'll be very quick with this, and then we'll move on. I'll call us back. Okay. I will bring us back together here. And as always, if you are on Zoom, please feel free to chat in, and Mary Ellen will read those off if there are responses. We are going to wait for the microphone for this, but are you interested in sharing, just put your hand up and Carol will get the mic started and we'll pass it around. Either question. We're not going to separate them. Anybody interested in sharing what you took from last week? Oh, wonderful. Oh.
So Chris and I chatted about it, and we were both surprised by the long list of agencies that exist to combat, if you will, the needs of people with whatever situation they have.
Yeah.
And that we still have all those people with needs. And
Yes.
even though we have that long list
Yes.
of agencies. And that we don't know about most of them.
Mhm.
So how do people find out about most of them?
Brilliant. Fantastic feedback. I will say briefly in response to that, many service agencies are experiencing this strange dichotomy of feeling overwhelmed with the number of people who need services and knowing deeply that the number of people they're seeing represents a very small portion of who could utilize their services. That's a familiar phrase. I'll have you wait for the microphone as well. Any others after that? We take one more after him if anybody else wants to.
As I'm walking,
Yeah.
I was
Okay, wonderful. We'll go from here to
shocked
here.
at the Ottawa County being number 3
Mhm.
on median income. I'm wondering, is it skewed because of the millionaires here?
Yes. Emphatically, yes.
John and I talked about it, and Alice was probably, like you and I talked about on the way in, the biggest learning for me of what that looked like,
Yeah.
and really the impact on our kids moving forward. And for me, the ironic part is really the people that are trying to help in teaching or other areas may fall into that Alice group.
You
right?
are, we are gonna,
That's kind of interesting.
I can see your name tag, Mike. Thank you. You're tracking with where we're going, both with our conversation earlier and that. We'll take one more comment here and then we'll dive into today.
A couple of us were really shocked at, I always knew the federal poverty numbers were low, the median, what they decide. But when you said you have to go up to like 400% of that to me was just really amazing.
Yeah. Thank you.
A lot of us thought that.
Wonderful. Thank you for your feedback. Thank you for participating in those discussion questions. Anything from Zoom before I move on? Okay, wonderful. So as a review, we did talk about federal poverty level. We started by defining Alice and just stepped into what we're calling the survival budget. So as a reminder, the federal poverty level for 2024 for an individual, $15,060 annually. And for a family of 4, $31,200. So that's looking at about $725 an hour to maintain full-time work and be under the poverty level as an individual, and either 1 at 15 or 2 at $750 at a family of 4. So that's just a slide from last week. And then we talked about the Alice population, and I'm just going to define this again, developed in New Jersey by the United Way. The Alice population is the asset limited, income constrained, and employed. Again, that may mean working, that may mean fixed income, disability, retirement, things like that. They don't have assets that they can liquidate when they have emergencies or need of immediate money. So that's the population that we're talking about. And so what we did at the end is we laid these two out next to each other and we said, okay, we know or perceive that the federal poverty level isn't a great measure. It's not really helping us understand what it means to be poor, because we have people making a lot more than that who are not doing well. And so United Way's work came in and said, right, let's study that. Let's give it a name. Let's quantify it. And we got the Alice population. So now we have a new name for a group of people who, in my opinion, because of lack of political will, are not getting the potentially resources or attention they need because the poverty level sits at such a low threshold. This level that was defined in the 60s by Molly Orshansky based on, I don't know, a low budget food diet is about 1/3 of an income. So we'll take that times 3 and then just adjust for inflation. All right. So this is a new measure. And what we're going to do today, one more slide here. The family of 4, you can see that jump is a little bit greater by percent. So instead of just basically doubling, we're going a little over 2.5 times. So we are going to be talking about the survival budget. What is a survival budget? As a reminder, this is an all-inclusive, lowest possible numbers and nothing available beyond what's budgeted here. That's what we're talking about when we talk about a survival budget. And I want to one more time offer this disclaimer. The United Way's pioneering work on defining a long excluded group of people not technically under the federal poverty line, but struggling to make ends meet has been critically important. The critiques in this presentation are meant to show that even this tool may be constricted in who gets counted, and or that the Alice population has to choose subpar options to find ways to meet this budget. So keep that in mind as I go through, because we're gonna look at their survival budget, and I'm gonna critique it a little bit based on what I find in the area, what I think is maybe even more realistic. So here is the Alice survival budget for an individual. I'm just gonna let you take that in for a moment. And what we're going to do is at the end of last week, we defined the top 3 expenses for a family of 1 and a family of 4. And we're going to just walk through those together right now. So in 2015 and 16, the average price among my peer group for renting a 2-bedroom apartment in Holland was about $725 per month. 2 bedrooms were between $650 and $800 for the most part. I'm curious, what do you think it is now? And 12 to 15, 15, 18, 15, 15, 25. You're quite close. I went to apartments.com. Okay. This is I just searched our zip code and pulled the top, I think it's 12 to 15 listings. I did not do any filters. I did not look for the most expensive or the nicest. This is just what's out there. And these are all 1 bedrooms. No. Good question. Are any of these subsidized was the question. The answer is no. Subsidized apartments, last I've been checking, have between an 18-month and a 5-year wait list. So when I looked through this, I said, look, I want to do some math to get a realistic idea of what this would cost, but this is $2,700 for a 1-bedroom. I can't fathom what that is. So I eliminated some of those, what I felt like were really outlandish, over the top. And even after that, my average, just based on those listings I just pulled, was $1,550 for a 1-bedroom. And keep in mind, that does not include utilities. Okay. So you're paying for your internet, electric, trash, gas, everything else on top of that. Yes. Oh, thank you. If there's a microphone. And we should maybe put Carol right in the center of the room here so she can just spring up, or we'll try it one more time. Hey,
Got it.
wonderful.
I've been through all this trying to find an apartment for my friend who was an immigrant, a refugee. And the problem with a lot of these are, even if you think you can find one that's doable, if your income isn't at a certain level, and if you don't have a super good credit score, you don't even bother.
Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, there's more than just those 2. I'm gonna
Okay.
do a little quick review here. Was anybody at my homelessness presentation earlier this year? Anybody brave enough to admit they were there? Does anyone remember there are 4 factors that landlords typically check for? Income is one of them. And that has become a problem because it used to be they wanted to see about 2 times of what your regular income or your regular rent was. And then it went up to 250, and now standard is 300. So 3 times. So if you're renting a $1,500 a month, they want to see $4,500 a month in income. There's also credit score. Does I remember the other 2 they often check? Background, and the big one, eviction background, if you've ever been evicted. Yep. One other question?
For For a one bedroom, how many people are limited?
That depends on the complex. Usually you're going to see them limit that at 2. Usually. Now, do people always follow that? No, but you're kind of at the mercy of the complex or the landlord or whatever. Yes, a Zoom question.
A question from Zoom or a comment, I guess. As a student back in the 1980s, I was financially very poor, such as secondhand clothes, little money to buy books, and sometimes no money for food. I did not feel at all as if I was living in poverty. University was exciting, intellectually amazing, and great fun socially. How does that experience fit with the Alice population?
Yeah. We're sort of going to get to that, but I would say, I'm going to leave that for a moment. And later in the presentation, I think we're going to come back to that in the form of where does Alice impact people on the scale of 18 to retired? Where is it heaviest? So the importance of housing, owning a home is the primary means of transferring wealth in our culture. That is how we hand down wealth from generation to generation. So has anybody ever heard the term generational poverty? Traditionally speaking, you're talking about families who have not had property, homes to transfer down or to sell, again, that liquidate that asset and divide that money. So generational poverty is very closely linked to a lack of home ownership. Mortgage payments are often lower than rent right now. And when you're making a mortgage payment, you're gaining equity. This is sort of a no-brainer. If you had a choice, you would choose to gain the equity. Most people. There are some who say, I don't want to deal with a roof and a furnace and all of this. Let me just pay rent. And that made sense when rent was 60% the cost of a mortgage. You could put into savings what you weren't gaining in equity. But now we're seeing mortgages, especially for those of us who locked in mortgages, before this most recent boom in real estate. We have people with mortgages at 700, 800, 900, 1,000, 1,200 on decent homes, $250,000, $300,000, $350,000 homes, and they're paying $1,200 a month on that. And they're gaining equity on that. And they have that in their portfolio. Whereas people in the Alice population are trying to find somewhere to rent, and they're asking $1,500 a month for a 1-bedroom. According to a study conducted by National Association of Realtors, the typical homeowner accumulated $176,000 in home equity in a span of 10 years on a median priced single family home. And then over 30 years, that wealth gain increases to over $300,000. So when we talk about forces like generational poverty, it's crucial to see that through the lens of home ownership or property ownership, because that is how our system is set up. With rent costs soaring, many people can't save toward a down payment to get out of the spiral. Holland has had a rough 15 years with housing stock following the 2008 boom. Does anybody kind of tapped into the real estate market here at all? A little bit? Okay, here's my understanding. This is not my background, but this is the narrative that I keep hearing. We had the big fallout in 2008. People come in, a lot of time external investors, a lot of whom are from the Chicago area, buy up homes cheap, very cheap, convert them into or leave them as duplexes. So I buy a duplex for, say, $70,000, $80,000, $100,000. In my neighborhood, that's what these homes were selling for. They now they own it outright, and they're pulling in at that time, maybe $1,500, $1,600 a month, just pure profit. On top of that, you see the market start to build back up over time. What happened when the market started to hit a critical mass in the last 5 years to those duplexes? What did those owners do? Say again? They raised the rent, or they sold. They turned that $60,000 or $80,000 home into, what does anybody know what a not nice duplexes are going for in Holland right now? 300. 300 for, I mean, I have had a lot of friends looking for duplexes precisely because they're in this Alice population. They can't afford to pay rent and they can't afford a mortgage. So the only option they can think of is I'll buy a house and rent out half of it. Well, there were some homes in need of some TLC on the market, and they were starting usually around 300. Okay. So these landlords cash out. Now, a lot of the people who buy these duplexes, they're these nice kind of larger old homes. What do they do with them? They turn them back into a single family unit. That makes sense. It's hard to find housing here. You maybe don't have the money to build, but here's this duplex. You know, actually, if you knock out that door, open the stairwell back up, that's enough for our family of 4 now. Instead of 2 800 square foot apartments, you have a 1,600 square foot home. What does that do to the housing stock? Decreases it. Where are those duplexes normally located? In the areas with the more affordable housing in town. So you're not only taking out duplexes, you're taking out stock from affordable housing, and it's just ballooning in value. So all of these forces come together, and we're already behind on housing. Ottawa County is, I think, the fastest growing county in Michigan. Okay, and we are stumped on housing. Now we're getting there. We're making progress, but it is a bit of a slinky effect, and the tail is a little far behind on the head. So households, the number of households in Michigan over the years from 2010, we've had a 22% increase. Excuse me, this is not Michigan, this is Ottawa County. So this is our population growth as a county right here. It's pretty substantial. And remember, this is households, not population. I may have misspoken. So think of individual units rather than total population. Okay. So we have seen a little bit of a different story on what it costs to find housing in our county than maybe what the Alice survival budget suggests. Let's take a look at transportation. The survival budget for Ottawa County includes $462 a month for a car payment, gas, repairs, and insurance. Okay. I'm curious, nationwide, what do you think the average car payment for a new car is? 400, 600, 500, over 700. Someone's being bold back there. You're right. This is the average for a new car. Okay. What do you suppose that is for used cars? 500, 400, 525. This is average. Now, granted, this is nationwide, but I don't think cars are substantially cheaper here than they are most places, right? So keep that in mind as we start talking about this transportation budget, because we just saw they're budgeting $462 a month for everything. And the average for a used car is $525. We also have on that the fact that you have gas money, and this is Grand Rapids gas price over 10 years. There's obviously a massive spike at one point, but let's talk about overall trend. 67% increase. I mean, I feel this too. We all feel this, but some of us feel this in a different way. Some of us feel this as, oh my gosh, this is getting crazy. And others feel it as, I wonder if I could walk to work at least a day or two this week. It's only 6 miles. Truly. In the winter, no less. So I went on Facebook Marketplace. Anybody here familiar with what Facebook Marketplace is? Okay, wonderful. It's a buy and sell set up on Facebook. I said, I wonder what's actually out there. I wanted to make this as sort of earthy and organic as possible. So I took 3 cars and we're just going to take a look at them. This is verbatim off of the listing. 2010 Dodge Caliber SXT Sport Wagon, 2,250. Good, reliable running vehicle. Front bumper needs to be replaced. Will eventually need spark plugs and brakes. 165,000 miles. I thought, oh, okay, yeah. Repair estimates going to be, you're looking at an additional $750 to $1,100 there, pretty much up front. And that's not including the bumper. Okay. So is that affordable? Ooh, that's a tough stretch for people in our population we're talking about. Let's look at this next one. We got a 2013 Dodge Dart, price tag way better, only $1,250, but needs a transmission. Old one is in the car on the passenger floor. Also along with the battery. Everything else is good. I loved that. Everything else is good. Fixer upper, yeah. For the handyman, yeah. Repair estimates start at $3,500. All right, and they go up from there. Let's look at one more. Ford Fusion. Oh, that one looks pretty nice. $3,500, okay. Yeah, it's a little pricey, but look at the description. This car has been well maintained and looks great from the outside with only minor cosmetic defects. It's in near new condition aesthetically. It's a nice looking car. They continue on. Key features, brand new 17-inch Michelin all-season tires with less than 1,000 miles on them. Clean and spacious interior with modern features. Typical of the Ford Fusion SE model. Seems like a pretty good deal if you could somehow get $3,500 saved up. Does anybody know what's coming next? Please note the car has an engine problem. It starts but does not run properly. This would be a great deal for someone who is handy with cars or looking for a project vehicle. Now, I don't know how hard this would be to fix. I don't know much about cars, but this is what people are frantically looking for transportation. This is what they're finding. $3,500 and you might even be able to get it running. $1,250, transmission is in the car. It's in the car. Literally. On top of that, in 2024, we made the coveted move out of first place for the most expensive insurance in the country to second place. Anyone want to guess who's first? Surprised me. Louisiana. I don't know if they're doing the no fault thing with us. I don't know what that's about, but that's what I found online. So strange. So we're in one person household. We're looking at this survival budget. We've considered 2 out of the top 3 expenses so far. Let's look at the third one, healthcare. Survival budget for Ottawa County. And remember, this is the Alice population. This is the threshold that's substantially higher than poverty. They're budgeting for $174 a month, and that has to include either your insurance premiums and or your out-of-pocket expenses, your co-pays, all uncovered expenses. Now, this was interesting to me, and I couldn't find any great information on why this happened, but the previous Alice survival budget was $400. I have to assume in some way the methodology changed where they were previously lumping things in healthcare that maybe are now part of miscellaneous because the miscellaneous budget went up. Yeah. Oh, microphone. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a guess here, it might be because of the changes to the ACA and the subsidies that are available to people in potentially this kind of population.
Yeah.
Where it reduces the monthly premium substantially.
Yeah. That's a great piece of feedback. Thank you for that. If you're not aware, the Affordable Health Care Act, the ACA, Obamacare, created subsidies for people who couldn't afford traditional insurance. When I left a previous job, I was without health insurance, and I went in and met with someone, and they said, "Great, here's this plan for you." Actually, I think I'm going to get into that. I'm going to put pause on that story for just a moment because I expect it's coming up. Yeah, here it is. I was working full-time in 2023, had an affordable plan for my spouse and I, both healthy. We paid $750 a month. Now, this was after originally I had subsidies for this, and we were paying around $300 a month. Interestingly enough, that went through most of the year. When I got a job, they calculated my income and what happened to my taxes. I had to pay back a bunch of the subsidy I had gotten, which luckily we knew about and saved for ahead of time. But that is probably not typical. Okay, so once I was employed again full-time, the cost went to $750 a month. Anybody want to guess what our individual and combined deductible was for $750 a month for two healthy? 5,000, 8,000. It was 17,400 for combined the first year, and it went up to 18,750 the next. What did you just say? Catastrophic. When I was in college, I didn't have health insurance, couldn't afford it. And I remember buying what they would call back then a short-term major medical. And I would joke around about how ridiculous it was. I said, this is pretty much good if I get in a helicopter crash on a Tuesday. And other than that, I'm kind of skunked. And that's what some of this felt like. Now, we had some, we had co-pays, so that helped. But this was one of the most affordable plans we could find. And with an $18,000 deductible. Okay, so here we are once again, back to our survival budget for an individual. And I went ahead and made some changes to it. With just that one change, that wage jumps from $1,550 to $1,913 with just accommodating or making a change for housing. This is the better measure we have. That's so much better than the poverty level, which is absurdly low. And a part of me wants to say, this is incredible work. I'm so grateful. And what are you doing to find housing for $814 a month? Does anyone want to guess? You're rooming for sure. You're absolutely sharing. You are not finding something for $814 a month, including utilities here. So you're sharing space, almost guaranteed. What kind of spaces are you looking in? Not great places. Maybe studios, one bedrooms, maybe living with family, maybe living in situations that aren't really great, but it's all you can kind of manage. Right? A lot of my clients wound up sharing spaces in trailers with neighbors, friends of friends. Or we had at one point a family the family owned the trailer. It was mom, dad, two kids. They had a 2-bedroom and they had 2 large dogs. And then they took in family of theirs, which was mom, dad, 3 kids and 2 large dogs. And they charged them a chunk of change for rent, which it's not a commentary on charging for rent, but I wish I could say that's like an extreme outlier I'm using to make a point. It's not as extreme as we might hope. 2 comments. We'll start up here and then move it back.
You just brought up trailer living. Is that more affordable? Should we have more trailer parks?
So trailer parks are a bit tricky in that they used to be substantially more affordable. The trailers themselves are and were and still are substantially less than a mortgage. But what do you pay besides the fee for the trailer? Lot rent. That is the privilege. You don't own the land. So you're renting the land that your trailer is on. That used to run $300 to $400 a month, probably trying to think when I started working, maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago, you could find that for $300 or $400 a month. That's up to at least 800 many, many, many places. Yeah, we're going to go here and then we'll come over here.
We live in America. We have an attitude to what we expect in life that is absolutely extraordinary. Just having grown up in Great Britain, teeny weeny houses, tons of people in them, 1 bathroom, it's all normal.
Mhm.
And the expectation here is so much grander that you look down on people sharing a house. But I see so much housing that's not being used in people who've raised their family and they have a 4-bedroom house and they're using 1 bedroom. They got 3 bedrooms spare. And now they're going on to a fixed income because they're retiring. So money is short. Well, the obvious solution is to rent out those bedrooms, particularly to an individual older adult or a young person. But there's so much stopping that happening
Yes.
because everybody renting is, of course, evil. But what if we could change that paradigm and make it easy for somebody to rent out a room in their home and encourage better home sharing?
While Carol walks the mic over here, I want to, and then we can come back for one more. I want to comment on that. I think you're spot on. I think the American understanding of what is required to live in a space is astronomical compared to almost anywhere else in the world. And I think that's worth saying. I don't think that makes it wrong, but it makes it unsustainable. To your second point, what you're describing is a concept that people are calling, it hasn't, yes, there's a home share is kind of the rough category this is under, and more cities are exploring loosening zoning regulations to make that easier because it is so unsustainable where we are at now. So if you're interested in reading more about that, if you Google home share, you will probably find some good information. In fact, I was a part of an effort that tried to help start that process here in Holland. And around the same time as the UDO, are we familiar with the Unified Development Ordinance? Don't quote me on that. It was a legislative process to try to change the zoning laws here. And everything passed except for the key provisions we would need to do things like that easier. And this is where all the signs came up in town about you're going to devalue my property value. We don't want those people living in our neighborhood. So I think you're onto something. The rest of the world sees you're on something. Other places in our own country see that that's important. We're struggling with that locally.
I seem to recall that trailers depreciate
So,
like a car, so you're not solving for the generational poverty issue. Is that correct?
so strange, yes, and I don't know as much about trailers and trailer parks. My understanding is that's still fairly true most of the time. What is different is trailers on land. So, or modular or manufactured homes. And those are actually bucking the trend for the first time ever, as far as I understand. They're gaining in value, and not by a little bit. I crawl Zillow and sites like Zillow and look at houses to torture myself. It's terrible. And if you find a property anywhere, especially south of here, you get into Fenville, Allegan, Hamilton, in that area, look, if you scroll down on Zillow, there's a price history that shows the last times the house was bought and sold. And homes that were bought last between 8 and 20, 25 years ago are jumping 500%, 600%, 700%. They were sold maybe for 25, 30, 40,000. They're going for 250, 300 now. I can't fathom. We're going to come back here and then we'll come to that for the last one.
One comment regarding the housing. In Holland City, Hope College converted many older homes to cottages for student.
Mhm.
And that depleted the lower end housing stock.
Mhm.
So what the comment is should Hope College be more helpful now in providing housing? You know, maybe like what they're suggesting is building more,
Yeah.
multiple housing dorms and releasing some of those cottages for some.
It is
people.
a fair and good question. And that is certainly an influence in the local housing market. not being an alum and not being totally familiar with what's happening, I have heard that critique fairly regularly. And as I go on walks around my neighborhood, which is near Hope, that seems to be true. And when we talk about where affordable housing tends to be or have been in a heat map in our area, that also seems true. I don't know the extent to which that could be changed, will be changed. I don't have a great amount of insight on that specifically, but I would say I think it's the right question.
And there was another comment related to when you were talking about Obamacare, the healthcare
Yes.
costs. This individual was saying, if you're employed as well, some of the healthcare plans also have high deductibles. You know, you're employed and you have a choice as to what healthcare you can select, but some of those are still putting you kind of in a hole from a healthcare perspective.
Great point. And on top of that, because healthcare and because everything is getting more expensive, we're in this weird place where sometimes companies will offer people money to not take health insurance. Well, if I'm in the Alice population and I can get an extra few $100s a month by not paying for something that I hopefully won't need. But then when you do, here we are again. Last comment here for a moment.
Well,
And then
I did home sharing. I lived in Evanston, Illinois. I was recently divorced. My son was in the hospital long-term. My daughter was starting college and I was in graduate school. So for the first time, I had a young man that lived in my basement for about 2 years. He managed a fast food restaurant in the western suburbs. He worked in the evenings and stayed in my house in the daytime. I really never hardly ever saw him. The next person I had, I put a note up at Northwestern University and I had a young man come from Paris. His dad was a diplomat from Taiwan. He was in Burkina Faso. This young man lived with me for 5 years while I was in graduate school and he's getting a PhD. I had no problem with it all. My neighbors had no problem with it all. In fact, I traveled a lot for my work and he took care of my dog and he always made sure my driveway was shoveled when I was coming back from a trip. So this can work very well. It really did. I mean, my kids were both gone. My daughter's in college. My son's in the hospital. I'm going to school. I've got college costs for my daughter, going to Topeka every month to see my son in the hospital. So, you know, you do what you need to do.
Yep.
And it's really, I don't think my neighbors ever said anything. And I met Patrick a few times. His mother actually came from Europe instead of a couple of times. His dad came from Washington to check me out to see if his son could live with me.
that's wonderful. I mean, this is an
So,
advertisement.
I mean,
for
you
home
can do this and it's,
Yeah, I'm going to have both of you hold on for a moment. We're going to keep going and I want you to write down what you're thinking about so we can come back to it. All right. So let's look at the same thing now for a family of 4. Some expenses are similar, some are different. We're back to the survival budget. Okay. This is their best guess on the lowest amount of money you can spend and get by. So take that in for a moment. How together and are they? Yes. Thank you. How recently were the numbers put together and what is their area? The numbers I'm showing today are specifically for Ottawa County and they are part of the 2024 update, which primarily uses data from 2022. Okay. So the expenses, as I understand it, are as recent as they can get. So let's take a look at these. We identified last week the 3 most expensive were housing, childcare, and groceries. So housing, I did the exact same thing, but I didn't put all the pictures in here. $1,750 for a 2 to 3 bedroom based on apartments.com. That's on the low end. Okay. Childcare, again, I really wanted to kind of source this out. So I got some comments from just everyday people around Holland, but I'm curious, throw out some numbers. What do you think we're talking childcare for 2, an infant and a preschooler, total, not per kid, per month, what do you suppose you're paying? 2,000, 2,500, 5,000, 1,000. So according to the 2021 Alice report, they were figuring you could come in around 1,100. According to the Holland Sentinel, a story they ran in 2022, they were pricing it around 1,800. In 2024, there was a post in Grand Rapids Facebook group for $2,350 a month. And so I thought, well, what does this actually look like? So I posted in, again, Holland Informed. If you're not a member, don't ever look it up. It is the definition of a dumpster fire. I said, for a research project, I'm trying to find the real cost of childcare, but few publish their rates online. What is a realistic price for full-time childcare in Holland? I know it depends on many factors, so feel free to include whatever details you wish. Here are some of the responses I got. I'm an in-home provider and charge $225 for all ages, diapers and wipes and meals included. Okay, so that would be $225 times 2 for 2 kids times 4 weeks a month. We pay $250 a week per child for full-time care in a daycare center. We paid $265 for under 18 and $250 for over 18 months, $225 for the second. That included an employer discount. $318 per week, $425 per week per child. So you're at $850 a week there. This is one email response I did get, which they haven't stopped emailing me since. I don't have children. They are very interested. And I can see why. $315 and $285 a week. Childcare costs, the cheapest I could find was $1,600 a month, and that went up to $3,400 a month. So let's call it an average $2,000 a month. We're going to come back to that. $2,000. Groceries. The Alice report predicts $12.58 for groceries for a family of 4. And I just want to note the way that that's changed in 4 years, 25%. In the CPI, we talked about the CPI last week briefly, the Consumer Price Index, are saying over 4 years, that's been a massive increase, 25%. Many of you have noticed this. I have noticed this, right? The grocery bills, it is incredible how few items you have to buy to hit $50 or $70 worth of groceries. And that affects all of us. But again, it affects some people disproportionately. So this is their survival budget, and I had to, again, take a red marker to it. And the numbers change quite a bit. That is a mistype. That should not say each, that should say total. So 23, 22 each, or 46, 44 total for a household of 4. Yep. So their budget was around 39. Mine came in, what is that? 15%, give or take, higher. A little over 15% higher. So I'm curious. Turn to someone next to you and try to come up with a small list of jobs that you think are common for people in the Alice population. And if a household of 1 needs, according to the survival budget, $15.50, according to me, $19 an hour, and a household of 4 needs between $39 and $46 per hour, what kind of jobs pay that? So turn to someone next to you and talk about those 2 things. What are common jobs, and what would you need for a job to pay that sort of a wage? All right. What are we thinking? What are we thinking about what kinds of jobs this population might be working and what kind of jobs pay what they would need to survive? Let's start with the first one. If you're just going to shout out a job or two, you don't have to wait for the mic, but if you're going to develop on that at all, wait for it. What kind of jobs? First year teacher, home health aides, hospitality, say it again, cleaners, construction, factory. You're nailing a lot of them, actually. Daycare, yes. Say again. Pest control, maybe. I don't know if that one made the top 20 list I was on, but yeah. Agriculture, big. Retail is another big one. I'm going to give you the top 5 in a moment. So we have one subset of jobs that you all just named that you think might be common. Let's talk about overlap. What do you need to make 80+ thousand a year? Are any of those in that list? Maybe manufacturing. Managerial, yes. Painting. I have a number of clients who are professional painters. Work is irregular and doesn't provide benefits, but can pay as high as $35 an hour. But that's for professional, and they're covering all their own expenses. Skilled trade, there are those. Plumbers, electrician, yeah. Let's take a look at what the data from this. So we're going to zoom out from Ottawa County now because I can't get that data, this data that granular. We're going to look at Michigan as a whole. These are the most common occupations in the Alice population and numbers. Fast food or counter workers, cashiers, personal care aides, waitresses, and cooks. I didn't do this ahead of time, so forgive me, but 280, 340, over 400,000 people represented in that, we'll say. And hovering around 50% of those workers are under the Alice population. Your median hourly wage. Now, keep in mind, when they say Alice population, they're using that survival budget metric that they've developed. If we were using my numbers, go up a little bit. Okay. Change in the wage. This is fascinating. Those wages are going up. Look at those changes. Those are substantial. But these numbers are after the improvements. So after a 42 or 45 or 20-ish% improvement, we're still seeing around 50% of the people in these roles in the Alice population. On this chart, I've got the top, I believe it's 20. You'll see some of those that were just in our other chart that I picked out of here. The green stars are by the highest paying. The red stars are by ones that generally require a degree. Anyone notice anything? There's some overlap there. % of software developers, and they're making almost 50 an hour. Our registered nurses are clocking in at 38. Managerial, someone mentioned over here, doing great. Sales representatives. So a common question I get, if they want to break the cycle of poverty, why don't they just go to college? Let's talk about that. I'm curious, and this doesn't have to be a long, in fact, I'll just take, because it's just a number. Anybody willing to shout out what you paid for a 4-year college degree when you went? $20 grand? 4,800? Yeah. Few thousand a year is kind of what I'm hearing. What do you imagine that's at today? I'm hearing 100 to 200,000. Let's take a look. This is the first site I found. The state average for so this is Michigan as a whole, to go to a state school in Michigan for 4 years, including your tuition fees and lodging, you're about 99,000. For a private school, you're at about 162,000. What does that not include? All that includes is your tuition, fees, and lodging. So in a way, the answer is everything else. I didn't feel like those numbers were in line with what I had seen. So I dug a little deeper and found another, doing this last night. And I thought, those numbers, that's gotta be a pretty optimistic look. So I looked at a few other places and I found this. For the in-state public school, you're at about 28,000 a year, for about 112,000 for the bachelor's degree. For in-state public, you're at about 45 or around 180,000, or that's, excuse me, for out of state. And for private, but those who receive substantial financial aid packages, they may pay as low as 16,000 a year, but the price tag's closer to 56,000 a year, which is $225,000 for that 4-year degree. Yes. Funny you should say that. The comment was, and debt. What do you think the current student loan debt in our country is? I heard someone say 50 total. I heard somebody say 50 billion. I heard somebody say trillions. 1.5 trillion. I got to start getting prizes to throw out. You're very close. 1.74 trillion, which is double the US annual defense budget, 1.7 times greater than the national credit card debt. And for a fun fact, if you paid $100,000 a day, you'd have paid it off in about 47,000 years. Now I got a little carried away with this. I kept going. If you had stacks of $100 bills, you could get to the International Space Station 5 times. $1 bills, you could go around the center of the earth something like 6,000 times. These are big numbers. For every working adult in our country, that comes out to over $10,000. So let's talk about what the Alice report finds when they do their 2024 update, which is through 2022. First of all, they trace us back to the Great Recession. Things were not good. You'll remember the Alice tool was only just developed at this point and wasn't widely used. This is in New Jersey at this point. So they start kind of backtracking, looking back at data, what they can, and then they say, wow, you know, over actually the 2010s, the situation gets somewhat better. And for the first time in 2019, the number of households in the Alice population in Michigan starts to decline. And then the pandemic hits. Michigan has a 2% growth in number of households from 2019 to 2022. And during the same period, the number of Alice households increased by 13%. And our population has been declining since then. Now, earlier you heard me say fastest growing, that's Ottawa County. Now we're talking about Michigan. So what factors contributed to economic changes for the Alice population in 21 and 22? How did things change from 21 to 22? We don't have time to do this as a discussion, so I'm just curious, does anyone have an idea? What were the big changes from 21 to 22? More generally, the subsidies, the benefits that we brought out during the pandemic. In fact, they were so substantial that in Michigan, a family of 4 with 2 parents working full-time in 2 of the most common occupations were only just able to afford the household survival budget, when including the expanded child tax credit, the child independent care tax credits, and the economic impact payments. But the expiration of these pandemic era expansions means that the same family a year later was eligible for $15,000 less in federal tax credits and payments than they were in 2021. Huge impact. And the numbers are starting to bear that out. We talked last week about the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which is 200 plus items, including restaurant services, wine, new appliances. It's quite broad in what it's tracking. So they created the Alice Essentials Index, which is the cost of items in the survival budget. And what they found, wouldn't you believe it, the Alice is the orange line, the CPI is the blue. If you can't see it clearly from where you are, the growth in the orange data set is quite a bit higher than the growth in the blue. That is to say, the necessary items that somebody needs to survive, the rate at which they are getting more expensive over time outpaces the general metrics that we use to measure these things. Urban areas were 18 to 26% more expensive, but inflation is growing faster in rural areas. So it's kind of hitting everyone. So John lives downtown Holland and works 6 a.m. until 2 p.m. at a factory in Zealand. Rent is due in 2 weeks, and he's overdue on his utility bill. The cupboards are getting bare, and his 97 Camry's brakes just went out. His last check went to diapers, cell phone, and internet, putting gas in the car, and paying auto insurance. Turn to someone next to you and share some thoughts about what John will maybe prioritize with that next check, and what will be the impact of that. Start to draw some conclusions, and we're going to come back together. Again, I think these will be kind of quick shout outs, so I'm not going to ask you to wait for a microphone. What do you think? What's he going to prioritize? Wow. Very consistent response. You're right. In almost every single case of this I've seen, that is right. Why? You have to be able to get to work, because if you can't work, what will you lose? Everything, and the housing will be first. And this population knows that when you do not have housing, everything else becomes tenfold more difficult. You must maintain your housing, which means you must work, which means you have to be able to get back and forth to work. So all of the other stuff is going to have to slide or wait, or I'll figure it out later. Because if I can't drive my car and I can't get to work, it's all down from there. Why not carpool? Why not carpool? Inconvenient. Finding people, unreliable. And that's the big one, reliability. You will see, if you are a member of certain Facebook groups in town like Holland Informed, there are consistently people saying, anybody able to get me to Hardee's every day for the next 2 weeks at 5:30 in the morning. And there are a lot of good Samaritans in this town, a lot of wonderful people. And guess what? When push comes to shove and something comes up in their life, that ride they committed to for a stranger on Facebook, it's not going to hold the same weight as it does to the person who needs to get there for their job. Is that to say there's never another solution? Not at all. And people find those. They get those creative solutions when they need to. But as a general rule, that's the prioritization that I see. Yeah. The bus, and that's specifically why I set it up the way I did, is because the buses aren't running yet. And that's real. Many, many, many factory shifts, Alice population-based jobs start early enough that the bus is not available. Yep. Might get them home. So updates continued. In 2022, 37% of households below the Alice threshold had emergency savings or rainy day funds, compared to 67% of households above the threshold, which is a decline of 4% in Alice population and 7%. So it's getting harder for everyone to maintain that savings. I was actually sort of surprised that only 2/3 of people not in the Alice population have any sort of emergency fund set aside. I'm under the impression, and I can't say this with certainty, that the general rule they use for the Alice emergency fund or rainy day is either 500 or 1,000. We're not talking heaps of money. In 2022, we have the entry of 100,000 additional households below the Alice threshold, while our state's population has declined. So here we can see the different thresholds. We see that if I move my mouse, can you see it? Yeah. Here in the 2018 to 2019 was that first decline that I talked about. And then here we are up 4% and then up 8%. So about 12% collectively. So, man, there's so much content and I want to leave time for questions. So we're not going to do this as a discussion. I'm just going to let you think about it for a moment, put them in the order you suspect from the least likely to most likely to be Alice and assign percentages. And to the person on Zoom who commented earlier about what's it like being a student now kind of question, this is what I was kind of holding on for, because what you find is that students are actually in a tricky spot where you have almost 40% of them below the Alice threshold, but that doesn't compare to the single female headed with children families at 73%. So to reflect briefly on that question that was asked earlier, 2 out of 5 students are trying to figure out how to survive with their money. So I don't know if it holds that same sort of carefree, enjoyable way it did before. Same thing. Here we are again with actually under 25. Now we're expanding that age a little bit from students are in the worst shape, with seniors also in a tricky position. So let's make this hyper local. This will be one of our last things we'll do before I open it up for questions. Who has, in your opinion, who is doing the best? These are the 23, I think it is. Yeah, 23 municipalities in Ottawa County. Who's doing well? Grand Haven, Park Township, Port Sheldon, Spring Lake. Who's struggling? Holland, Allendale, Crockery. This might surprise you. Here's the map. You've got your 17 kind of square ones, then you get your towns and these kind of different shapes here. Your top 3, meaning the least amount of people in the Alice range, Robinson, Zeeland Charter, and Jamestown, are all hovering around 20%. But Ferrysburg, Zeeland, and Grand Haven are around 50% as of this last report's numbers. Is it population density? Yeah, some. This blew my mind because as a transplant to Holland, I always thought Zeeland was sort of the, I don't know, the wealthier place that people escaped Holland to. And when I saw these numbers, I thought, oh, somebody made a mistake. They've got Zeeland way too high. And everywhere I looked, it's the exact same data. A lot of the nicer areas are township. So when we talk about this being an issue right at home, I mean, I said earlier, Ottawa County was like 33%, I think. The state of Michigan was 41%. That was last week. When we get very specific and zoom in, It's surprising. Yes. Where is Park Township? Right here. Oh, I'm so sorry. My mistake. We're going to do that right now. So here's the whole county. And you'll see Holland City is crawling right up there towards the top at 41. With Holland Charter Township not far behind. Yes. This is our backyard. This is our home. The data would seem to suggest that there is a substantial difference in the township versus the city. The comment is cities provide services, so there could be some cause and effect. People move out of cities because of taxes. And now we start to think about some of the effects of that, which we don't have time to get into today. A comment was made earlier during a discussion about the way Holland's housing has not kept up with the need for the growth and the what we call workforce housing, which is people who are living and working here in not extraordinarily well-paying jobs. And can you remind me where you said you're at? Are you in Park Township or Holland City now? Okay. The comment was places that used to be bedroom communities, people maybe going to Grand Rapids, have kind of turned into trying to make space for people who are trying to live and work here, which is fine, which is good, but we're not keeping up with the need for what we're calling workforce housing. So why is the increase in industry coming here? I do not have enough specific study on that, but my my liberal arts education says there is something attractive about Holland, both in what the city is and offers and the knowledge of there being people here who are looking for work. And there's a disconnect between the need for housing. And we actually had some large employers come to us in one of my roles and say, can you help us understand what is happening? Why can't we find people? How do we maintain people? So I have to quickly move through this wrap up, which is just to say that the ALICE and racial identity, seniors and ALICE, cost of public assistance and wages, wellness indicators are things we're not quite going to get through the way I'd hoped because there's just so much information. But take a look at this and you're going to see some pretty huge discrepancies where your dark blue is poverty and your light blue is ALICE and the orange is above. And if you take a look right in here, there's a bar that is way further ahead. And then you've got two that are generally quite a bit further behind. This bears out when we're talking about systems level issues, when we're talking about things like generational poverty and systemic racism. You're going to see the monthly budget for adults over 65 growing way faster than Social Security is keeping up with, and already substantially far above the federal poverty level. And then this is a report that I was going to bring up, but we're not going to do that. So let's open it up for some questions. If you could, please wait for the microphone. We'll go here and then up front. And is there any on Zoom? We'll go to Zoom after those two.
I'm looking for hope. So my question is, it's been hanging around since the healthcare segment when we talked about healthcare. Has the ACA Obamacare helped? And because we worked so hard and struggled so mightily for so many years to get Obamacare, that was the best we could get.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about, is that a hopeful situation or is it not really any better?
Trying to stay within the bounds of my sort of expertise, I would say the bones were there and it has anecdotally, the clients I work with have benefited greatly from it. However, it has been stripped down and watered down at every turn, which has drastically undercut its effectiveness. And so we're back to sort of a question of political will. And we have a candidate who, as I recall, and I'm happy to be corrected on the exact words, had an idea of a plan, a concept. Now, it is not my position or my expertise or my desire to say how health insurance in this country should work from this podium. But I have seen something that I think represented hope to a lot of people and did help many be kind of systematically dismantled. And that has left a lot of people in the lurch.
Back to housing in Holland. During the Depression, my grandparents had a home on 14th Street.
Mhm.
And there were times that they had 3 of their children living there because they lost their jobs.
Mm.
A lot of them lost money. And many of those homes in the core city were converted to 2, sometimes three families. But the newer homes after World War II, many of those are smaller homes, story and a half. You just don't convert and have an extra bedroom or kitchen, things like that.
Yeah.
But there are things Holland could do in the core city to make it much easier to have 2 families. That's my opinion.
Agreed. I would agree. And one of those ideas that you'll see, I'm a little bit confused on the details. Originally, I thought that there was a certain number permitted and allowed, and I've since heard that it may be more of an economic feasibility and not a city government limitation. But there are what's called ADUs, auxiliary dwelling units, that people could put potentially above a garage or on their property in the back, that would allow people to turn a green space or a garage into probably a studio apartment and get a little bit of income from that. And my understanding is there is a group of people in City of Holland, not the City of Holland, but living here, working on ways to try to make that an economic reality for people who don't have whose return on investment would be so long, it's prohibitive. So they are exploring, how do we add ADUs for our community? But of course, we're also up against zoning laws. So point well taken. I think there is a path forward. I think core city needs to be a part of that, but we've got potentially an uphill battle on some of those things. Zoom.
You know, in this course, you've outlined you've defined what the Alice population is and kind of what some of the challenges they face are. And agencies are having difficulty kind of meeting these needs. And maybe this is another class, but what would it take, what is needed? What would it take to sort of address or better address these challenges? I mean, that's a big question, I guess.
Yeah. It's a great question. And I'm trying to think if there's a way that I can respond to that honors the depth of it. I would say the places that I find hope are places like Community Action House and the Food Club. The Food Club was developed for the Alice population. When I was hired there to help start building this model, working with what was existing, and trying to figure how do we take the food pantry that we had at Community Action House for, I think at that point it was like 47 years when I had been hired, and how do we turn it into something else? How do we turn it into something that doesn't just give people a box of food and say, hope you like it, good luck, but that gives them empowerment and choice and scales up their dollar for them, and all of the other now radical things it's doing far beyond anything that I ever had to do with it. Those kinds of initiatives, I think, are the answer from a systems level. I think it has to be some nonprofit ministry church, it has to be some local government, and then there's the individual response. I think as a whole, I probably can't get into it a whole lot more than that, but it's a wonderful question.
Yeah, I was wondering if there's any way to determine how many of the Alice population employed people are working at more than one job.
Oof. I have not seen that in their data. I can tell you anecdotally, it's extremely common. Multiple part-time jobs, seasonal jobs on top of full-time jobs. Very common, which of course, then even if you were going to be eligible for benefits, you're not. And many of them wouldn't have been anyway. I don't have, to the best of my knowledge, anywhere that has parsed that out yet, but it's the right question.
It seems to me that one big piece of this, which may not be really hard to deal with, would be the transportation. I mean, if right now buses start at 7, couldn't they start at 6 or 5:30? I mean,
Yep.
it's just, it seems like that might be more of a doable piece. And when I've been in Fenville, I've noticed that at the Michigan work site, they said something about buses coming in from like other employers actually send buses to pick people up.
Yeah, great comments. Transportation for many people has seemed like low-hanging fruit, and many have tried to address it. The Max Bus company system either recently completed or is in an ongoing process of gathering feedback and getting a lot of information about if, how, and when people would like their services to change. I suspect that's been completed for a little bit now, but I'm excited to see what comes out of that. I think right now it's one of those, we're kind of on the cusp of not a lot of people use it, so it's hard to make the argument to invest in it, but until it's more user-friendly, people aren't going to be able to use it as well. Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to go back to your comment about political will.
Yeah.
And make a plug for Bread for the World, because in order to create political will and to push forward political will, you have to have advocacy. And when I first started working with Bread for the World back in 1980, lots and lots of churches were on board, and because it is a Christian lobbying organization, people were heavily involved in the offering of letters that was trying to address a particular issue related to political will.
Yep.
But now in 2024, there are only 4 churches in the city of Holland that participate.
Yeah.
And because everybody has become so divisive politically that nobody wants to advocate.
Advocacy is a critical piece of any larger movement like this. And until we can find ways, this is not something that one party is going to fix. There are going to have to be inroads with other political communities. And I think you're right. Advocacy is the cornerstone of that work. But I think you and I might have said last week after the session, people are much more willing to give money to something and then ignore it than they are to stay involved and really invest themselves in it, which is a tricky dynamic.
One of the
Zoom, and then we'll finish up.
I'm a transportation expert, or claim to be at least. Maybe I should have said it that way. But I did shock some people here in town. How many major inner city stations are there? We all know where the Padnos Depot is over here. How many people know about the BP station out on M40? That's where the Chicago Grand Rapids bus stops. It does not come downtown.
Yep.
Nobody knows about it. It's a sort of Macatawa area coordinating committee didn't even know that stop existed as they planned bus stops.
Yep.
So you've got that. And also employers are not willing to say, let's just change the hours to 7 to 3:30. Employers are not willing to let people start at 6:52 and get off at 3:19 to catch the buses. And that discourages transportation. So till we can get a drive towards transportation, you got a huge expense in that automobile.
Yeah. And I love the phrase drive toward transportation. That sounds like a campaign effort. Point well taken. I'm going to come back to Zoom. We'll come up here first, and then if there's a time, we'll come back there. Go ahead.
The question from Zoom is, there's this idea of worthy and unworthy poor.
Yes.
And how does that affect the Alice population?
The Alice population, I think, are often seen as more of the worthy poor because they are employed. That is not a blanket statement, and we're seeing more cultural pressures against them because I worked hard and it worked well for me, so you must just not be working hard enough. That narrative is still, I think, very present, very problematic. And I think it's less of a dichotomy of who's in and who's out and more of a, someone help me with the word, a scale, continuum, thank you, of the closer you are to being like me, the more acceptable you are. And the further away you get from that, the more problems I have. We're gonna have one up here. And then we'll take one last one after that.
I'm just wondering how the availability and the use of rental cars might help those that can't get rid of the car, and we can rent it and have availability of use.
Yep.
And not have to pay repairs and yada, yada.
It's a great question. Through current large places, I'm thinking like Enterprise or Hertz, not feasible. Last time I looked for a rental car was in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. 3 days was $550 for the smallest kind of base model unit they had. That's obviously one example, but it's not affordable through that. Now, an idea that I'm currently discussing with a few pastors in the area is what if there were a way for private, like in an individual, or if I could buy a car where I could handle paying the auto insurance, which is the big hang up because nobody wants to insure a car that's not for one person. And I could charge nominal fees to rent it to, say, 5 people in my block and work out a schedule and work out ways to do that. Is that a feasible path forward? It's very early in that conversation. I'm excited to see if or where it goes, but auto insurance is the big hang up. Last question.
You had the comment on families moving together in manufacture the mobile homes. And it just strikes me strange as, okay, and how do you fund the dogs? I'm trying not to be judgmental, but that just seems to be an expense that's not necessary or appropriate if you're struggling elsewhere.
Yeah, it's a fair question. We will often get questions. I often get questions about people who come to food pantries in a nicer car than I have, or people who have pets, or they've got the newest iPhone. And so a few things to keep in mind. One, it's very possible that they had that dog, that pet, that phone before they fell into this difficult time they're in. And as a pet person myself, I would sooner starve myself than not feed my cats. There's a bond, and when the world feels against you, that might be the only life-giving connection you have. So I think there's some of that. There is also an increase in people surrendering pets. There is, in fact, I was just at Harbor Humane this last week, and I believe, if I understood correctly, they have sort of a temporary foster program for people who become homeless and hope to resolve the situation within a certain amount of time, but they need someone to take their pet so they can go to the mission or they can live in their car. So there are ways that people are trying to do that. There are also pet supply pantries. So the answer is there's not a clean answer, but sometimes it's because they've had the pet, sometimes it's because they get it supplies for free, sometimes it's because they can't find someone else to take it, and sometimes it's because it's the only thing they have in life and they're not going to give that up. Appreciate the comment.
Daniel, I think we're past your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you are interested, I have some cards up here. Feel free to come grab them. Thank you so much for being here and have a great rest of your day. Happy Halloween.